A leaflet of history. The acts of the demagogues are the same now as they were centuries ago. If he pursues his plow more adroitly at the present time, it is but because of his greater ingenuity. The plan itself remains the same. Our attention has been recently called to a paragraph in Lord Bacon's history of King Henry VII, in which he treats of the Cornish rebellion, quote unquote, under the guise of keeping the peace, and persuaded a portion of the people to take weapons in their hands, not to do any creature hurt, but in order to present a strong petition. The result, as may easily be supposed, was open hostilities, a civil commotion, rebellion, bloodshed, and defeat. There are numerous specimens of Thomas Flammock, the lawyer, now going about as well among the people of Mississippi as among the abolitionists. And a lot of the abolitionists, they knew that they had the bloodline of the Moors in them. I have the study of Robert Purvis, who was one of the establishers of the Underground Railroad, and he stated specifically that his bloodline was from the Moors. So that's why he started to be an abolitionist, to fight against slavery or brother or sister being bound, no matter what color their skin is. Man is not flesh nor soul, but spirit, and one with the law. What is more to be regretted, they adopt the same argument, appeal to the same prejudice, and carry about fire to cool the temperature of the political atmosphere, with the same assurance and dexterity that their prototypes of English history exhibit. Instruction of both as to the wiles of politicians, and as to their result, it is gained by pursual of the following. It is taken from Volume 1 of Lord Bacon's work, page 361. No sooner began the subsidy to be levied in Cornwall, but the people began to grudge and murmur, the Cornish being a race of men stout of stomach, mighty of body and limb, and that live hardly in a barren country, and many of them could for a need live underground, that were tenors. They muttered extremely that it was a thing not to be suffered, that for a little stir of the Scots soon blown over, they should be thus grinded to powder with payments, because he was taxing them to death so he could get finance to go to war. And as in the tides of people once up, there want not commonly stirring winds to make them more rough. So this people did light upon two ringleaders or captains of the rout. The one was Michael Joseph, a blacksmith. The other was Thomas Flammock, a lawyer, who by telling his neighbors commonly upon any occasion that the law was on their side, had gotten great sway among them. This man talked learnedly, as if he could tell how to make a rebellion and never break the peace. He told the people that subsidies were not to be granted nor levied in this case, that is, for wars of Scotland, for that the law had provided another course, and therefore that it was good they should not stand like sheep before the shearers, but put on harness and take weapons in their hands, yet to do no creature hurt, but go and deliver the king a strong petition for the laying down of those previous payments, and for the punishment of those that had given him that counsel, and to make others beware. After that, these two, Flammock and the blacksmith, had by joint and several pratings found of consent in the multitude. They offered themselves to lead them until they should hear of better men to be their leaders. But see, you can't look at someone to be your leader and be your salvation. You got to walk that path alone. The consequence, Lord Bacon tells us, was simply a civil war with the slaughter of about 2,500 men. So they was all murdered, brothers and sisters. You have to understand, Henry VII, his son married Isabella and Ferdinand's daughter. And Isabella and Ferdinand are known for the Christian conquest to take over the Muslim dominions. And we're going to read here, the Reformation came an English Bible and an English service that struck the death blow. The service which the Cornish took in the rebellion was in some sort of a struggle of racial impulse. Certain of us understand no English, explained the stout Cornishman. We utterly refuse this new English. Probably they had understood Latin better, but they had an instinctive understanding that this new English must do away with their loved national speech. You have to stay honoring your foremothers and forefathers. Happily, none of them loved the speech well enough to do the other thing. No one took the time to translate the Bible or the liturgy to Cornish, which they didn't need to because they already had their own tongue. The English Bible killed the Cornish tongue. Again, the English Bible killed the Cornish tongue. So you Cornish that are standing there with the King James English Bible in your hand, you're dishonoring your foremothers and forefathers. The English Bible killed the Cornish tongue, but it did not convert the Cornish to Anglicanism. Maybe not then, but in these days and times, yes it is. They became nonconformist. But no, they just stayed who they was. They didn't become nothing new, nothing different. They stayed who they was. Richard Lionheart, a ruffian who passed for a hero. This is the story of an English king who could not speak English, a so-called hero who committed the most villainous atrocities, a blackguard who has been praised by poets and novelists for virtues he never dreamed of possessing. He was King Richard of England, nicknamed Coeur de Lion, Lionheart. When Richard was only 15 in 1173, he joined a rebellion against his own father, King Henry II. The rebellion was crushed and Henry freely forgave his unnatural son. But 10 years later, Richard was once more up in arms against his father, joining Henry's bitter enemy, the King of France, who also colonized and did crusades against the Moorish Empire, and doing all in his power to injure not only Henry, but also the country he expected one day to rule. Richard and the French king at last conquered Henry and forced him to sign a peace treaty. The shame of being humiliated by his son was too much for the old monarch. He died broken-hearted 2 days after the treaty was signed. Richard was now King of England. He had spent most of his life in France. He had not taken the trouble to learn the English language. He had apparently no interest at all, either in England nor its people, except what he could wring from them, huge sums of money with which to indulge his favorite pastime of warfare. Yet for the moment he was remorseful over his treatment of his dead father, and he won much sympathy by weeping in maudlin fashion at the dead king's tomb. Then less than 2 months after he was crowned, he left England and joined a crusade which was aimed to win back the Holy Land from the Saracens, which I told you was the Moors. They was doing a conquest, man. The Christian Crusades against the Moors. Richard wanted money for this venture, and it's just because he was having fun with warfare. Richard wanted money for this venture, so he not only overtaxed his people, but sold back England's rulership of Scotland, which his father had won by hard fighting. And he didn't win nothing. Killing people off the land ain't winning something fair and square. They was colonizers and murderers, and they committed genocide and took land by force. Might is not right. Spiritually, they are sinners. Richard wanted money for this venture, so he not only overtaxed his own people, but sold back England's rulership of Scotland, which his father had won by hard fighting through the Christian Crusades. Having done as much harm to his kingdom in 2 brief months as he comfortably could, Richard set out on the crusade. Of all the many crusader chiefs in all the various crusades, none perhaps has won as much fame as Richard. And this ain't fame, that should be disgrace upon your face, using Christianity, using God to kill people off of their own land and forcing them to turn away from their own tongue. That's why our foremothers and forefathers was fighting against all this BS, because again, their divine creed was Islamism, love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. And on so little justification, beyond the capture of one Saracen city, Acre's surrender were not fulfilled to his liking. He retaliated by massacring 2,700 helpless Saracen prisoners whom he had captured. While certain deeds of ferocious courage in Palestine won for him the title of Lionheart, yet he did far more harm than good to the cause of the crusade. It was largely through him that the leaders quarreled, because they wasn't trying to put it all on the out front that they was murdering everybody like that, but all of them was doing it. They just wanted you to do it more quieter. It was largely through him that the leaders quarreled among themselves and failed to conquer Jerusalem, trying to conquer Holy Lands. There were 2 rival candidates for the title of King of Jerusalem. They conferred the title before taking the trouble to capture the holy city, trying to take over stuff. These candidates were Conrad of Montferrat and Guy de Lusignan. Richard favored Guy's claim, but he was forced to consent to Conrad's election. Conrad was at once murdered and Richard was charged, whether rightfully or not, with the crime. Man, this dude was just causing chaos. And that's exactly why our ancestors was fighting against this BS. After twice advancing to within sight of Jerusalem, Richard gave up the crusade in disgust and started home. After he just killed all them people for no reason, he was shipwrecked on the way and was imprisoned by Archduke Leopold of Austria, whom he had once insulted and struck in Palestine. So all this stuff probably has to do with these days and times as far as Palestine. Leopold turned him over to the German emperor, and Richard lay for months in prison. That's the karma he got. Finally, by taxing his people again and by swearing to hold the English throne as a mere servant of the emperor, he won his freedom. He hurried back to England, where he found his younger brother John, and the King of France had stirred up a rebellion against him. He put down the revolt, forgave John, and made war with France. Again, he only stayed 2 months in England, just long enough to raise more money. He was just a fiat chaser. He went to France, where in 1199, after a 5-year war, he was killed while attacking the castle of noblemen who had found some buried treasure Richard was greedy to seize. During his 10 years' reign, Richard had spent just 4 months in England. He had over-impoverished his country and had done nothing for it in return. So died Richard Lionheart, bad son, bad husband, bad king, and worst man. England has had 3 kings named Richard. All 3 were more or less blackguards and all died violent deaths. I was going over the manuscripts of the prayer books as far as the Henrys and how the Cornish refused it because they were speaking the Latin liturgy. So what they did was they translated it from the English into Latin. Then later, the Hampton Court Conference was in order by the king in response to the request of the Puritans for a uniform translation of the Bible. This was completed in 1611 and is commonly called the King James Bible. So actually, the Cornish refused this Bible. They put it into Latin and then they translated it back into English, and it was the King James Bible from the prayer book of the Henry. So this isn't the book written by the hand of God. This is a book written by the hands of men over and over again. Then it speaks of how Queen Elizabeth burnt a different Bible, like they was burning Bibles and all kinds of stuff. And again, we have brothers and sisters who's walking around with this Bible in their hand for their earthly and divine salvation, when their foremothers and forefathers directly refused it and disputed it and went to the grave fighting against it. They also have the slave book, where they took out almost half of the Bible and they would give it to the slaves. And it didn't say as far as let my people go, or if you have your neighbor do labor, then you must pay them wages. They took out all kinds of different stuff so they could use it to enslave you and turn your tongue away from your foremothers and forefathers' ancient ways. They did it to pale skin and melanated. You should start being more reserved when people place things in your hand for your earthly and divine salvation. We're going to close out by giving honors to Mother Dolly Pentrieth for credit of having last spoken Cornish, who was buried at Fulham near Mooseholt in 1775. But she could not have been the last person to understand Cornish, otherwise it is certain the following epithet could not have been written over her resting place, which signifies Old Doll Pentrieth, 102, dead buried in Paul Parish, not in the church with great people, but in the churchyard Old Dolly lies. It is easy to recognize 2 words here, eglos and popul, people, as genuine Latin, just as we similarly find an infusion of Latin in present-day Welsh, but a traditional knowledge of Cornish, fast becoming corrupt, lingered after Dolly's death. It is even said that only 10 years ago there was living at Zinner near St. Ives an old man who knew a good many Cornish words, which he had learned from his father. These words seem to have been chiefly the names of places. It is only about 2 centuries since the clergy of some Cornish parishes, particularly toward Land's End, used to preach to their people in the old tongue. For a parallel to Cornish, we may now go to Brittany and hear the peasantry talking. It has been said rather doubtfully that these peasants, when they come over with onions, can go into the cottages of Welsh folk and converse. This sort of thing would have been far more possible in Cornwall a few centuries since. The Bretons and Cornish are very much of one race, and their speech shared the kinship. It's just like Aramaic or Arabic. It's the same language with different dialect. There is still a Cornish dialect, which differs from Devonian, and which contains a few old Celtic words, like the great is more. But on the whole of the words of West Country speech are Old Saxon. It is only the accent and intonation that are Celtic. Banner of Henry VII, the red dragon quartered with other Tudor badges. Red dragon pesant, badge of Wales, from manuscript in College of Arms. If you made it this far in the demonstration, congratulations to you for your due diligence, brothers and sisters. That's due diligence. And if you ain't realized by now, the Cornish temple, we are studied, brothers and sisters. We turn every stone. If you want to find aught, you ask Allah to be your protection, your guide, and your salvation. And when you study, you'll be able to turn over every stone and find the truth, and to be able to pick off the falsehood from truth like a tick, sucking on the blood of aught.